All right, so right now we are going to switch over to a talk, and I am delighted to introduce Vince Weaver, coming to us from the University of Maine. I wish I had your job. You actually get to do this almost for a living. This is on writing a PT3 Vortex Tracker player for the Apple II. And I'll let you do all the talking, but I will simply introduce the PT3 Vortex. Vortex Tracker is a program. It's a system for playing tracked music. PT3 is Pro Tracker 3. I'm sure you'll say all this more, but this is a way to get tracked music, just like you hear on a lot of these other platforms, finally onto the Apple II, which otherwise, at least historically, at least officially, has very limited sound. I believe it's some bleeps and bloops is pretty much all they meant it for it to really do. In fact, this actually is the very format that we used for our Vectrex demo, which many of you got to see yesterday. And I think it would be absolutely hilarious to try playing our Vectrex music on an Apple II. So maybe if you have some time later, we can play with that. So, all right, I turn it over to Vince Weaver.
Thank you. So yes, we'll talk about that. So I'm an associate professor at University of Maine. My research, I mentioned this last time, it's mostly high-performance computing and embedded systems, things like that, operating systems. And so what goes on at UMaine? You don't know if you've ever heard of the University of Maine. It's up outside Bangor. And so I was going to work the other day, and there's a sign for this, the world's largest 3D printer. And so apparently we have that too. This actually made national news. So what they do, they actually had Guinness there and validated it was the biggest world's 3D printer. So they printed a gigantic boat, and then they put 2 US senators on it. You can't see it, but there's Angus King and Susan Collins there, and put in a big indoor wave tank. And this makes me happy because it makes my research seem a little less weird when people are doing this stuff. So, other UMaine connection, Chuck Peddle, the designer of the 6502 processor, actually went to UMaine a very long time ago, and we actually convinced him to come visit this past year, so I got to meet him. So that's me with Chuck Peddle. And while we had it, we had a little exhibit, 6502 exhibit, while he was visiting, and so it doesn't hold a candle to the stuff you guys set up, but we actually managed to get a whole bunch of 6502 processors there. You can see a faculty member there schooling the undergrads in Atari 2600. They couldn't, whatever reason, they don't have the reflexes for it. So, but anyway, that's aside. What you're actually here today is to talk about the PT3 files on the Apple II. So here's an Apple II Plus computer that I do some development on. And the goal is to get good music on it. So the problem is, if you have an Apple II demo, you want to put some music in it. The Apple II built-in audio is pretty awful. It's more or less bit bang a speaker. You can sometimes get 2 or 3 channels out of it, but it still sounds pretty bad. So what often demo programmers use is what's called a Mockingboard card. There's a picture of one down there, and it's got 2 AY38910 chips in it for playing music. And so the idea is, if you have one of these cards, can you fit cool music and play it on an Apple II Plus with 48K of RAM? So you might say, what's an AY38910? So it's a music chip from the 80s. It gives you 3 channels of square waves, 1 channel of noise. It's got a programmable envelope generator. There's 16 8-bit registers. You program the settings. That's how you program it. Only 14 matter for sound. The other 2 for I/O, and for the Apple II, those are ignored unless you have that chip board actually has room for a sound synthesizer, voice speech synthesizer you hook up and program via the interface. But those are expensive and hard to find these days, so I don't have those. And then you generally just update those 14 registers as often as you want, typically 50 hertz, or if you're in the US, maybe 60 hertz. And the chip itself runs at 1 to 2 megahertz. It varies a bit by the system it's in. So if you're programming the AY38910, these are the registers. This is from the data sheet, and you can see it's got a bunch of things. The one thing to be careful with if you're programming this, the register numbers down the side are an octal, not decimal. So if you're using this and not paying attention, you get really weird results because you think you're programming R10 and you're actually programming R8. So other formats, there are other formats for doing AY music. One popular one is YM5. And this one's a very simple one. It's actually a raw register dump, just those 14 registers at 50 hertz. And you just pump it out to the device. It's very simple. The problem is if you do the math, 14 registers at 50 hertz, and if say you have a 120-second song, that adds up to 82 kilobytes of memory. And we said we're trying to run this on a machine with only 48 or maybe 64K. So, the idea that 82K is just too much might, to modern ears, sound silly. You just can't do this on these systems. And you can compress this. The YM5 file actually makes really small files. Part of how they do, they interleave it. So all the register 0 data goes first in R1, and that way the similar values are next to each other, and it compresses really well. And often it uses LHA compression, and so you can get these files down to 2K or less. The problem is you have to decompress it to play it. And it's not easy to do this on the fly, and it's also not easy to do unless you have a lot of RAM to do it on. So the goal is to run this kind of data on an Apple II processor, an Apple II computer from the 1977. It's when introduced. It has a 1 megahertz 6502 processor in it. Original model had 4K of RAM, later a 48K, then much later 64, 128K. And so a lot of demos with AY Music actually required a 128K system, and that way you can fit that 64K of music in the upper memory and the other. But systems with that much RAM weren't common until the late 80s. So I like to say I aim my demos for the 1977 original Apple II, just like Woz designed it. There's some caveats there. 48K in a system in 1977 cost a fortune, so most systems back then didn't have it. Also, no disk drive for the Apple II until 1979. Before that, you do audio tape, and I usually don't mess with that. I use disks for that. And the Mockingboard itself didn't really come out until 1981. It was a real peripheral you can get for your Apple II. I actually knew people had them. It was vaguely uncommon, though, so even though it's widely used for demo scene type stuff in new games, back in the day, there was only really a handful of games that actually used it. So goal, how to get things to fit in less RAM. So last year, I presented the Apple II Megadome here and how that works. And so there's some hacks you can get to use less RAM. One is you just have the sample rate from 60 to maybe 30 hertz, and that doubles the amount of sound you get. Drop some registers. If you don't need the envelope registers, you can drop the number of registers you need. You saw from the data sheet, many of the registers only use maybe 4 bits out of the 8 bits, and so you can sort of cheat and merge some of the things together, and then at runtime, remove them again and do it. Deduplication, so patterns in songs sometimes repeat, and if you ever repeat a song, you can sort of cheat that way, and you can try the compression. Even so, when I had my mega demo, I couldn't fit it in 48K. I had to cheat and use the language card, which was a sort of standard 16K RAM expansion for most Apple IIs, so it's still hard to hit things. So the idea is, could we use the PT3 format instead of YM5, something that can be maybe smaller? And so this is a tracker format, and often AY Music, especially for I'm going to call it the ZX Spectrum because I hang out too many British people sometimes, apparently. So the ZX Spectrum, Atari ST, and all that, those machines have the AY chips in them. And so if you go and find some cool chip tune you want to listen to, often they're released in PT3 files. On the ZXArt website, you can find a bunch of cool chip tunes there. And so what the file format is instead of having the raw samples, it has a standard tracker format, which means it's got the channels and instruments and notes. It's sort of like the mod format for Amiga, if you're familiar with that. And you can actually translate mod files better than you think into the PT3 format. And the files are small. They're often less than 8K. And a full player, you can get a full player that will run in 2K of RAM, or maybe more like 3 on the Apple II, on the Z80 2K. No extra RAM either. You can play it in place without needing any extra RAM, which is great. This is a Vortex Tracker 2 for making these files. It's made by a guy named Sergey Bulba, who is Russian, and this is what it looks like. It's just a sort of Windows program. I usually do my development on Windows, not on Windows, on Linux, so I use Wine to emulate Windows to emulate this when I'm writing them. And so downsides, you're trading memory size for CPU usage. So uses less RAM, but you have to sort of generate the sound on the fly. So it does use some CPU. It's non-deterministic. We'll come back to later. The YM5, it's a regular set of registers at a certain time. You don't do any calculations. It's very easy to do it in a certain number of cycles. Another thing was getting code to do this. You might say, well, why don't you just download a library or something like that? The only code for really reading it was 2 sources for source code for it. One was a Z80 assembly language blob, just very not much common in Z80. And the other one was in Turbo Pascal, had very few comments, and the ones that were entirely in Russian. So I made it a little more interesting to get it going. And you can find some file format descriptions online. The best one was on a Spanish web forum from like 10 years ago, and again, it was incomplete. But the goal was to get it going. So how quick could it be? I know just barely enough Z80 assembly language to sort of follow it. And I also know some Turbo Pascal. Back in the 90s, I actually wrote some silly DOS games for it, so, can you do it? So the starting point, there's a AY song playing emulator, emulator, and it comes with source code. And so there's a file called formats.pascal that's got source code to do it. And if you know Pascal, you can follow through it. I used to translate Pascal to C back in the day, and apparently I still remember how to do it. So the brief file formats, I won't dwell on it too much, but it's got a header, which describes the format, and it's got a list of patterns. So it has a list of the patterns of the songs to play, and then the patterns are there. It's got the idea of samples and ornaments. So in an Amiga mod player, the samples are actually often digital samples, where you actually take a digital sound and then you shift it up and all that, because the Amiga hardware could do that. We don't have that in AY chip, but what we do have is a list of these similar things, samples and ornaments. And what they describe is sort of an envelope or some frequency changes to apply to the note you're playing. So by default, the AY will play, you say, play me a 440 hertz square wave. If you tell it an instrument or sample to use, it'll take that and sort of modulate it as you're playing it to get some cool sounding effects. And so there's 3 channels, A, B, C. So in this data file, it's got a list of those, and it's got notes and attributes. So you'll say, play me A sharp at octave 4. And then there's a couple other attributes that you can set to it in effects, and it's all in the file. One other complicated thing is it's also got lookup tables for frequencies and volumes. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So the header, I won't go through it all, but your typical stuff. It's about 256 bytes of info. It's got the names of the module and the patterns, offsets, and where things are in the file. And then the effects, these are effects you can add to things, and they're things like you'd see in an Amiga mod player, like glissando and vibrato and things like that. Interesting thing is, if you look in the tracker and it says what you apply it by a number, it doesn't actually match the file format in disk, which confused me a while until I figured that out. So it doesn't, the tracker screen is actually lying to you about what the effect numbers are, but it works. The frequency volume tables, so they have these tables, these huge lookup tables. They're like a whole kilobyte, and there's like 4 or 5 of them. So that's wasting a lot of RAM. So what you can do is, if you don't want to waste the memory, is you can generate them on the fly. And so the provided code they have for the Z80 actually does that, but it's in really complicated self-modifying code. And the one I figured out what it was doing, the other one it didn't, so I just sort of went and I re-implemented it myself. But it's sort of ad hoc, meaning it bases this, which of these lookup tables to use based on the version number, which is something in the header, and it's sort of random which ones have it. So if you want to have a generic player, you have to handle all of these. It ends up being, I think, 6 lookup tables. If you're writing a demo, you can save some memory and just leave them out. And again, this is the thing, on a real-life player, 4K for a lookup table is no big deal, but when you're trying to fit in a small amount of memory, it might make sense to auto-generate this. So playing things, you find the current pattern it's playing, and it's got the pattern is in memory there, and it's divided up into lines. Often there's 64 lines in a pattern, but it can vary, so you have to handle that in case, sometimes the author might change it, and you can even change it from pattern to pattern, so it makes it a little trickier to decode. There's also a speed, so that says for each line in the file, in the display, it's how many 50 hertz or 60 hertz values it generates for each of the lines. And so when you play through it, there's a new note, you get what it is, and then you apply any effects or any samples and that stuff to it. And then after you run through it, you get the 14 AY registers you need to write out to the device, and then you're all set. Extra things you can do to make it more complicated, there are 6-channel files. So like I said, the Apple II Mockingboard has 2 of the 2 AY3 chips in it, so you can actually play 6-channel music. It's tricky to do that because it takes twice as much CPU, so at some point you're almost out of CPU for actually doing stuff. And these files, the file format, is just 2 of the PT3 files concatenated together with a different byte set somewhere in the header file, but you can play those. Invalid files, so when I was doing this and testing various PT3 files I could find, some of them just had completely bizarre values in it, but as long as the player played it, it was good, so it had to be bug compatible with the existing player. As I said, the patterns can be different sizes and lengths, so it means it's really hard to calculate the song length. You can't just take the number of patterns and multiply it out. You actually have to more or less read through the entire song to the end to calculate how long the song is, which is sort of annoying when you're trying to display the total runtime on like a player or something. So the first thing I did before taking the Pascal version and going to 6502 assembly, I went into C first. So I wrote a spec to figure out what was going on, then wrote C code, and then I made sure the C code, when I ran it through a file to a YM5 output, it matched what the actual AY emulator did, and so that's good. And so one of the first things I did, I actually have a Raspberry Pi chiptune player. So I actually have a Raspberry Pi that has a board you hook up to it with two AY chips on it. And so it actually writes over SPI and out to the device and plays on a real AY chips. And so I have a little chiptune player. If you're interested, I have links there. Here I had it playing still live from Portal on there, but you can find some videos of me. I guess it's cool. It's got the cool displays, I2C displays, and NV meters and all that, and was having too much fun there. So I got that working, and then for a while, since I have the code, once you have the code, you might as well put it everywhere. So it turns out, with the Raspberry Pi player I had, it actually has an AY chip, so you actually write the registers out, and the same. But we want to play if you don't have AY chips. So people have written AY emulators. So Alexander Sashnov has libAY-EMU, and so if you plug that into my PT3 lib library, you can play completely out to WAV files or to your sound card. And so I got this working, and so what's shown down there is I'm teaching embedded systems class, and we were using the STM32L476 development board, and it's actually got an audio out jack, which was, as an aside, insanely difficult to program bare metal, but I eventually got it working. And so it plays the chiptunes, emulates them, and puts them out there, and so it's this little board. And the nice thing is this is a small embedded board. It only has 128 K of RAM and a megabyte of flash, and you can load it up with PT3 files and play chiptunes for hours just on this little board, so it's pretty cool. And I also got it working on sort of bare metal on the Raspberry Pi, which you might see later today. So once I hit C, converted to 6502 assembly, and so that means I won't go into much 6502 assembly here, but you sort of end up being a compiler and see if you can get it down and working on 6502. And the format actually mapped pretty well. This format was written to play on ZX Spectrum, one of the 8 chip. So since it's already sort of targeted for 8-bit platform, it actually wasn't too bad to get it going on an 8-bit system. So the question is, once you get it and you have it running and you play the files, how do you know it's okay? How do you know it's working? And so you can listen with your ear and you can sort of notice the bigger bugs, but there's some very subtle things in the code, especially some of the effects to get them right. So one thing I did is I wrote some validation tests. And so here I'm running, this is the Apple II emulator AppleWin. And it turns out that the Apple II had a really advanced file I/O back in the day where you could redirect things, almost like a redirectable pipes under Linux or whatever. So you can print it to the screen, but by just changing the vector for where it's printing, you can also print it to the printer. And AppleWin lets you redirect printer output to a file. So inside the emulator, I could run this, I'd write these to the screen, redirect it to the printer, I get a text file on it, and then I could actually diff it under Linux with the actual results from another tool and get a diff. And you could validate that my 6502 code is generating the exact same thing the other tool is. And this takes a while because we have to wait for the whole song to decompress, but AppleWin's got a nice feature. You can crank it up to turbo mode where it runs super fast, and then you can get through it really a lot faster. So then I set up some validation tests just so that every time I make changes to the library, I can rerun them and then make sure I didn't break anything when I changed it. So some challenges to getting things working in the Apple II. So PT3 files are generally designed to run on European machines. So they often assume you're running at 50 hertz. And that's not a huge deal on the Apple II. The Mockingboard actually has a programmable interrupt timer. It's got 6522 I/O chips on there if you're familiar with those. So you can set your Apple II to run at 50 hertz interrupt as long as you have the Mockingboard card. The original Apple II doesn't have any interrupt hardware, so without the Mockingboard card, you couldn't do this. But since the Mockingboard card comes with an interrupt generator, you can do that. And then you can play them no problem. The problem we'll see later is if you're trying to do cycle counted things and you're trying to sync up with the screen, which runs at 60 hertz, you run into trouble. The other thing is the chip runs at the AY chip itself runs at a certain frequency, and that's how the frequency of the notes are calculated. And so in the Apple II, it runs at 1 megahertz, so the AY3 chip also runs at 1 megahertz, and that's how fast it runs. But the problem is some of the other chips that use this chip ran at 2 megahertz and 1.7 megahertz. What that means is if you want to play them, the frequency sounds wrong because it's expecting the chip to be counting at 1 megahertz and it's actually counting at nearly 2 megahertz. And so there's two ways to do this. You can either translate the PT3 files before you play them, or you can convert it on the fly. And so it turns out that converting from 1.75 megahertz to 1 megahertz is not too horrible. You can do some shifts and adds, but it adds cycles anytime you're trying to do this. So for example, you might want to do this for a player because you have some extra overhead, but if you're trying to do this in a demo, you might not want to do it. As I said, changing from 50 to 60 hertz is sort of challenging. You can just play it anyway, but then the song goes too fast. You can mess around and try to set the speed to 4 while doing the other one, and then you get it's like a 10% faster. It's tricky, and if you have someone writing the music for you custom, they can do this manually and make sure it's not to begin with. But if you're converting other sound to play on here, it gets a little tricky. So competition, so randomly, I went through this. I did this in the last year. I got this all working. And completely unrelated at the same time, there's this group that does Apple II demos, French Touch, in France. And as a side, you can look up his demos. They're amazing. They're very classy and make my demos pale by comparison often. But he also is working with a PT3 player, unrelated, and not only found out to release my code, he's like, oh, I got it working. He took a very different approach. Instead of going through C like I did, he more or less translated the Z80 code directly to 6502 and basically wrote almost like a mini Z80 emulator in 6502 to play things, which is a bit crazy. So it's sort of interesting. His demos are interesting too. When I try to do deterministic code, I use this, I talked about last year, something called vapor lock and reading the floating bus and cycle counting to get exact 60 hertz frame rate because Apple II has no way to detect the virtual blanking interrupt. Instead, he is using timers to sync up the Mockingboard with the code, and so we can play PT3s even when doing fancy cycle effects by using interrupts in complicated ways. And they're so complicated they break all the emulators, so it's sort of interesting, a little side there. So the player, I released this, wasn't thinking it was that exciting. Within a day of me releasing it, it was pretty amazing. People started using it in their stuff, right away. Before I even documented things, they ripped the code out of my stuff and put it in theirs and getting results, and it was sort of fun, even though I didn't have all the bugs fixed yet. It also can be useful for non-Apple II 6502 systems, and you might say how many of those actually have AY chips in it. But I know the Intellivision people working on television games and demo type stuff, that's got an AY chip in it, so it's useful for that. So one thing I made was the PT3 Player, so you can download, look at it. It's just a music disk, plays a lot of music, and you can load it up with PT3 files, and you can fit over upwards 40 plus minutes on a 140K Apple II disk, which is fun. And it plays, and it does a pattern on it. It does, if anyone follows online, the guy who wrote the books about the Doom, they reverse engineered the Doom flame algorithm. And so this is actually doing a sort of blue and purple version of the Doom flame algorithm. And it actually got 3 channels there, and it'll actually make the flame higher depending on the channel volume. It's sort of cool and all that. So I got that going. So optimizing the library for this, it started out taking nearly 4K, and after a lot of trouble, we got it down to about 2.5K. Part of it was by auto-generating tables. One thing that happened, there's a hacker named Cucumber who's sort of famous in Apple II community for being an amazing 6502 optimizer. No joke, you give him your 6502 code, he can make it, I'm only slightly exaggerating, twice as fast and half as big, and it's sort of amazing. And so he got a hold of the code and just went crazy on it, and so improved a lot. It's still not quite as small as the Z80 version, which I find sad because I'm a 6502 person. Part of it is there's a lot of 16-bit stuff going on. If you ever use a 6502 processor, it's really, really bad at doing 16-bit math. The Z80 has got 16-bit registers and 16-bit math operations, whereas 6502, you use 3 instructions more or less every time you want to do a 16-bit add, sometimes more. So how much does it use? So if you're doing scaling from 1.75 megahertz, the overhead's roughly 15%. That's an average. It's sort of hard to measure on the actual system. The way I'm measuring this is I tell it to play full speed without any delays, without interrupt, and then I do the speed comparison. And so it's somewhere in a range of about 15 to 20% overhead. And the code is small, it's the smallest version of it. If also in the 6502, there's something called the 0 page. The first 256 bytes of your RAM are faster the access, but it's a limited resource. And so if you're willing to give up half of the 0 page for just playing music, you can actually get the code a decent amount smaller. The default version of the version I ship, you don't do that because a lot of times with your demo, you're already trying to use up all the 0 page, and you're not willing to sacrifice that. So it's useful for using things. One place I used it, again, not really showing it off here, but recently I spent a good chunk of the summer taking the game Another World or Out of This World, was its name in the US, from the 90s, and seeing if I could port it to run on the Apple II. It never ran. There's a version for the Apple II GS, which is an order of magnitude better than this hardware. But I ported the game. I didn't actually port it. I actually converted it, meaning I never saw the source code. I just, based on watching the game and then going to it, I made a version that runs in the low-res graphics mode, the 40 by 48 by 15 color on the Apple II graphics mode. So it'll play the entire intro movie plus the first 5 levels, I think. And then the end sequence, and I got to the end sequence, and wouldn't it be great if it played the music? So I got the mod file, converted to PT3, and just dropped it in. It was a very transparent process. I just fired up my PT3 player, and so, so it's cool if you haven't seen this. I was working this summer, just recently at a demo party not long ago, a group released a 664 version of something similar. They're trying to get to work, but my version fits mostly on a 140K disk, whereas I think their version, possibly, they're using a 1 megabyte ROM card, so mine's a lot smaller. The graphics are, again, blockier, though, because I'm using this low-res mode. Other things using in demos, so I've tried to separate things out. So there's a library, PT3 lib, and so to use this, all you have to do to include into your 6502 code is include the PT3 file. It has to start at a page boundary, so multiple 256 bytes, and that just made the code a bit easier. You run a init routine, you set up the interrupt handler, and just enable interrupts, and away it goes. It's very, very simple to set up if you're just, if you have enough cycles free to have the overhead for 10 to 15% go, then you just get the music and it plays in the background, and it's sort of really easy to use. So the tricky part, what if you're trying to do cycle counted code? So I mentioned, if you're using, if you're doing some advanced demos and you're doing vapor lock and then you're counting and getting exactly 4,550 cycles in the VBlank and all that to get perfect cycle counted code, can you use this in there? And so I wasted a lot of time trying to do this. So could I write a PT3 decoder that would work in this type of code, meaning every frame that you ran it had to take the exact same number of cycles, because otherwise there's no way to find the VBlank on the Apple II, so unless you keep things the exact same number of cycles. And it turns out it was very complicated, and I wasn't quite able to make it work. 6502 doesn't make this easy. It's easier than modern processors. 6502 does have a very definite set of cycle counts for different instruction types. The big problem is when you cross pages, meaning if you are loading from a series of registers using indexing and you cross into another page, meaning crossing a 256 byte boundary, it takes an extra cycle. If you're branching and you branch across a 256 page boundary, it takes an extra cycle. So you have to structure your code exactly to either not do that or take this into account. The problem, the PT3 file has a variable size, and you can't really predict when it's going to cross pages and all that. The other thing is, I said you can have attributes on a note. It could be an arbitrary number. So it could be 10 or it could be 2. And so in order to play a file of a cycle in a very amount of time, you have to have a worst case scenario and say maybe I only support 5, maybe not even try to play files of more than that, but that takes time, the worst case scenario. And so in the end, I sort of gave up in trying to do this properly, because it got to the point where trying to play it in a cycle invariant fashion would take more than the 4,550 cycles you have in the VBlank. So not all is lost. I'll be showing a demo later that sort of tries to do this. And what you can do is use the player to decompress on the fly. And so as long as you can hide this while you're playing, you can decompress, maybe 15-second chunks of the music at a time to RAM and then play them from RAM. And so that way you're still not using the crazy, hundreds of K of RAM you need, but still play it. And it turns out you can sort of, by massaging how the things are, you can fit maybe instead of 14 bytes per frame down to 11 bytes a frame. So you can fit roughly, depending on your frequency, somewhere between 3 to 4 seconds of audio and 2.75 K of RAM, which, let me tell you, is a very awkward size. The way the Apple II language card is designed, you get 12 K plus 4K, but the 4K writes the bottom of the 12 K when you do the swap the memory regions around, and 2.75K is like the worst of not fitting well. But so one thing you could do if you're trying to be clever was actually, while it's playing some previous music, decode at the same time so it's ready. I was trying to do that, and then I realized I didn't write the code in a cycle invariant fashion. Not cycle invariant, I mean reentrant fashion. So meaning if it's playing and decoding, it was reusing data structures, and it was a big mess. So anyways, it's a huge challenge. I did get it mostly working in the end, but it's hard to avoid some glitches sometimes. But so it is possible, if you're willing to spend the time on it, to use this even in a cycle counting demo. It's just a tricky thing to do. So other things, and this is a side thing, and I don't know if there's any AY experts here, in figuring this out and messing around with AY, on the Apple II, the sound often sounds glitchy compared to emulators too. And so I was investigating this. I actually got out the oscilloscope, looked at everything. And the way it works is low level. It makes a square wave. And the way it does it, you give it a count. And so it counts up to that value. When it hits it, it toggles from 0 to 1, and then 1 to 0, 0 to 1. That's how it makes a square wave. And the manual says if it's greater than or equal to the value, that's when it flips. But if you're a hardware person, you know that greater than or equal to is really a pain to do in hardware, but equals to is fine. So it seems like it might have equals to in the hardware instead. The problem with that is, what if you're counting and you count past the value, and then you're counting towards the high value, and then you rewrite the register to be a low value. And if there's no greater than there, it'll just keep counting the whole way till it overflows 16 bits and back around, and then you'll get a music glitch. And that's what I'm seeing in real life, but I can't get anyone in the world to verify that this happens or not. And I've been tracking around things, even trying to find people who decap the chip and all that. So if anyone knows if this is true or not. The thing is, it seems to show up more noticeably in Apple II hardware, and there's probably possible reasons for that. The Apple II is the only one that's really running at only 1 megahertz, and so it means that the glitch lasts twice as long. And also, if you're coding for a specific system and you hear glitchiness, and you know if you just sort of adjust the sound a little bit, you can avoid it. Maybe they do that. So that's sort of an aside. I've been trying to track that down too. So, okay, good. So, yeah, so get to the end here. So all the stuff, the source code's available for all this on my website, and there's various Git libraries. Unfortunately, it's split between a couple different Git libraries, repositories, because I work on the C version separate from the Apple II version, so it's split up a bit. There's one more shout I want to do. There's a group who's doing something called Total Replay for the Apple II, which is they went and cracked all the old games, put them in a big disk image, and then they have a nice cool loader screen you can get and play all these old games and stuff. It's called Total Replay, and the guy, Apple II 4AM on Twitter, he does this, and Cucumber, the guy I mentioned, he helps too. And if you follow Apple II 4AM on Twitter, he's been doing this amazing series of things where he's writing high-res graphics on the Apple II transitions. And he keeps one-upping himself with cooler and cooler wipe transitions for it. And it's just amazing every day. He just does another one, and it's amazing it works. So anyway, you can check that out. My Another World, Out of This World port is actually included with that distribution too. So anyway, with that, any questions? Oh, thanks.
So we actually did mess around with PT3 for our latest Vectrex prod. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that we ended up having a lot of trouble with that we didn't anticipate is some crazy Polish chiptune musicians like to use the envelope generators to generate sawtooth waves for a bass line. Mm-hmm. And it turned out we had a lot of problem with the math doing the frequency conversion. Did you ever run into that?
Yes. I have seen that. Yeah, a lot of groups do use the envelope generator to do the baseline. There's something specific I was just thinking, I just lost what it was. But because of that, that's why I often translate the frequencies on the fly instead of, I've had people suggest, for the Apple II, why don't you translate all the frequencies ahead of time? But I think unless, as you said, unless your scale, like the envelope values, I think scale a little bit, maybe that's what you're talking about, scale a little bit different than the regular frequencies.
I think it was worse for us because I think ZX stuff was generally 1.75 megahertz or something like that, and then the Vectrex was 1.5, so that was like a really weird ratio. The problem was when we tried to translate it so that the pitch was right, we'd end up changing that period from like 11 to like 11 because none of the digits stayed around, and then it was out of tune. Yeah,
I've seen that same problem. The ones with the faster clock rates, they definitely have more resolution to mess with. And when you scale them down, you do lose the sounds. They don't always sound as great because you have sort of flattened out at the low end the frequencies you have. So yeah, I have seen that with the Apple II.
Okay. Thank you.
I may have missed this if you answered this question already, but when actually like playing the tracker music, how much of the CPU is busy doing that, or can it do other things while it's decoding?
It could do other things. It's somewhere around maybe 15 to 20%, depending on, it depends a bit on the sound file and all that, but it's.
So 15% is doing the audio decoding, or 15% is free?
15% is doing audio decoding. You still have, about 70, 75%. You can definitely, I even play games, you can do stuff in the background, and there's still, with 3 channels. If you try to do 6 channels, then it gets trickier, because then it takes up a lot more. But with just 3 channel sound, you're good.
Cool, awesome job. Excellent presentation.
Thanks.
I may have missed this, but you mentioned VBlink, and wouldn't you want, I may have this backwards, but wouldn't you want to do the sound outside of the VBlink so you can do graphics work in the VBlink?
Yes, it depends what you're trying to do. A lot of the demo type stuff I do in the Apple II recently has been doing some crazy stuff while the screen's being drawn, and so there's just no free time during the actual screen draw to do audio. So for my cases, I actually try to do the sound in the VBlank for the most part. But that is true. If you're doing things where you're not actually racing the beam in the actual screen drawing, then you could move the sound up there, then have a lot more room free in the VBlank.
Okay,
Yep.
thanks.
Mm-hmm. Is that it? Anything else?
Well, thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.
All right. Give us 2 minutes to switch over to DOS.